And we're recording. Welcome to the Unpicked podcast, our very first episode.
Yeah, this is our 2020 review episode.
Exactly. We are going to review and highlight some of the key stories, the big stories, some of the interesting stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, shall we jump straight in?
Let's go straight in, all the way to January.
There was optimism in the air. People were looking forward to a better year.
Mm-hmm.
2019 had been stressful, a lot had happened, and we were hoping 2020 would be different. Do you remember how you felt on the first day of January?
I mean, that's always typical of a new year. If in January, there's always a sense of optimism.
Yeah.
So for me, 2020 was no different.
Yeah, same here. But I remember waking up on January the 2nd and going on Twitter,
Mhm.
and I think World War III was trending. And maybe that was an indication of things to come. Trump had just assassinated a top Iranian general. And over in Australia, things were looking scary. There was these massive fires and all those heartbreaking pictures of koala bears and kangaroos fleeing the fire.
Yeah.
And then there was this story about this virus in China. Do you remember
Yeah.
the first time you heard about the virus?
I think, just like you said, just that there was this new respiratory virus, very similar to SARS. But there wasn't a sense of concern because just like SARS 1, the very first one, because this is SARS 2, they were able to manage it really well. And I don't think it even left Asia. So I wasn't worried.
And looking back, I don't think the government was worried or even thinking about it because the Tories had just won this big majority and they'd promised to get Brexit done, whatever that was supposed to mean. And I remember in mid-January, the biggest story was whether or not Big Ben was going to bong for Brexit and whether there'd be a crowdfunder to pay for it.
I don't even remember that, I'll be honest. I don't think I even paid attention to any of that. I think for me, January was, like you said, Brexit, the fires in Australia, and Greta. And
so the 31st came. There was some party in central London, but I think there was a conscious effort on the government not to be seen to be gloating too much. So there was a virtual, I think there was a countdown projected on 10 Downing Street. And this was the moment the government was supposed to launch its new program. But the 31st was also the first day that we heard about cases of coronavirus in the UK. And so by early February, we'd heard about this virus in China, and now China had locked down the city of Wuhan of about 11 million people. We started hearing a bit more about the virus, about wet market. I'd never heard about wet market before, had you?
Yeah, had you not heard about it's a very Asian. It's not just an Asian thing. I think it's a very Asian African thing. These places where there's not much refrigeration. People like to eat their meat fresh. They want to go out there and pick the chicken that they want. And so wet markets are quite a common thing.
So that was new for me. And when I saw what kind of animals they had there, I was thinking, well...
what animals they didn't have? They have everything out there.
It was like Noah's Ark.
But all dead.
Yeah. It was getting closer to home. In Italy, we started seeing those stories of people singing from balconies. This really worrying story about that the government might have to lock down people in Italy. Italy declared a state of emergency. But at the same time in the UK, Boris Johnson gave a speech where he basically said, if you want a piece of us, you can have it.
It was like a personal challenge to the virus.
Essentially, because he said people are saying we should shut down the economies and etc. because of this virus, but one country needs to remain open, and that was going to be the UK.
Boris is the same person who went to the wards and shook hands with every single person. Was that in February? Or was that in March?
Well, it was around that time.
Okay, because I remember seeing that. Where he went to the wards and he shook hands and he said, come at me, bro, to the virus. He said, we're British, we're going to keep calm, we're going to keep carrying on, and we're not like those weak Italians over there, essentially.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. You'll be pleased to know, and I continue to shake hands. And
I remember someone even saying, this is why we're having Brexit.
How do you link those two events?
You cannot make it make sense. But this idea of, look how bad the Europeans are dealing with it. And almost a bit of schadenfreude, right? That the Italians are struggling.
Yeah.
It can never happen to us. Over in America, things were not too different. We started seeing the first cases in America. The first death in America was in February. But again, the political class there was not focused on this. They were thinking about the impeachment and Trump getting acquitted. They were thinking about the Democratic race to be the presidential candidate. And Trump was being Trump. So you had this thing where, two of the most powerful countries in the world were almost sleepwalking into a crisis.
February is really when it became real for a lot of people. And I think because I think February is also when World Health Organization said that this was an impending pandemic. It was big. We need to be, they praised China for how they'd quickly responded to things that, like you said, they shut down Wuhan. And I think that's when for the rest of the world, it became big.
Yeah, and it was also the time when we started seeing hand sanitizers at train stations at work. And I think that was the moment for me became personal. How about you? Was there a moment when you started thinking about it a bit more?
Yes, same thing. So I used the underground a
Mhm.
lot. And that was when I started seeing the hand washing posters. Same thing with my workplace
Yeah.
as well. There was all these posters about 30 seconds, sing happy birthday in your
Yeah.
head, get in between the fingers, all of that good
Yeah.
stuff. So I think that's when it. So, and I think also with the posters as well, there was a sense of we can still handle this. It's okay. Just wash your
Yeah.
hands. Because at that time, I don't know if it was well established that it was a respiratory
Yeah.
illness, and there was nothing about social distancing. It was just about wash your hands, don't touch your face. There was nothing about masks.
Yeah.
It was just wash your hands, don't touch your face, and you'll be okay.
Yeah, to me it felt as if we were recycling the kind of winter messaging stuff. When you see the posters in winter. I mean, February is still winter. So I started seeing the Catch It, Bin It, Kill It posters coming up more often.
I don't think it was quite catch it, bin it, kill it, but similar.
I saw Catch It, Bin It, Kill It,
And you did not see that.
which is a catchy, phrase. Someone should put it to a song if they have.
You didn't see that.
I swear I did. I think somebody just recycled, maybe in my building or something like that. It's like, okay. We come to the end of
Yeah.
February, so it's becoming an increasing issue in our consciousness. We're having to change our lives a tiny bit. I mean, to be honest, you should be washing your hands anyway. But the whole sanitizer thing was becoming, a bit more prevalent. March is when it really kicked off. Now, everyone was talking about
Yeah.
coronavirus, which in Italy, China, South Korea going into lockdown. And lockdown became a word that was now in our public consciousness in the UK. Everyone was talking about lockdown. And but at the same time, again, the government here was not doing anything massively about it in the first weeks of March. Boris was on holiday. He was on holiday with his new younger girlfriend. At the same time, he was fighting horse case in court. And he'd missed 5 emergency meetings about it.
They don't have Zoom over where he was on holiday? Because was he not in Barbados?
I think
Where was he?
he was somewhere, he was somewhere far.
But they don't have Zoom over there? As in, I understand he's on holiday, but you don't get to turn off completely. And it seemed irresponsible, but also unsurprising, because this is who Boris has always been, this sort of clownish, blustering, blundering character. And I think in the UK, similarly to in America, we collectively have this, what's the word I'm looking for, this sort of fatigue of scandal. We have a scandal fatigue. It's 10 years ago, it would have been horrible. It would have been unimaginable, like you said, that our leader goes on holiday, sort of ignores the entire, there's this emerging crisis. It's a big crisis that has the potential to affect millions, and he's just gone off and he's not answering our calls. I think over here it was just, that's Boris.
Yeah, that's Boris. But everyone knows you never take your phone on holiday, right? That's just bad well-being practice.
Really? Wait, I've not heard about this. You don't take your phone on holiday?
You don't take your work phone.
Oh, your work phone. Say that then. Okay, for those who have work phones, don't take on holiday. For us who don't have work phones, just take your regular
phone. Don't take
phone.
your work on holiday. Unless you're the PM. Trump was doing the same thing. He was going golfing and, just tweeting about everything but the virus. The tone started changing mid-March when the government started taking it a bit more serious. But they still let this massive horse racing event take place. 250,000 people over 4 days. And also they let this massive football game between Liverpool and the Spanish team take place at a time when cases in Spain were spiraling. You just get this picture looking back of a government that just didn't want to have to deal with it and just hoped it would go away.
That's a very That's a very interesting way to look at things, because I think the idea of if I can't see it, then it's not real. This sort of hands off approach, sort of only respond to things once they're unignorable. You can't ignore them anymore. You have to deal with them. Is an approach that I feel we've seen this over and over again. The lockdown only happened at the end of March, after cases in London and across the country were rising so quickly that the government absolutely had to shut down. Even when they did it, it was very reluctantly. It was in a very unplanned way. Boris had addressed the nation on a Sunday, I think, on a Sunday evening. That was quite late, and he'd said, we're shutting down everything, and we're shutting down things immediately. There was no, okay, you have a couple of days, get your shopping done, sort out your caring, if you have caring responsibilities, figure that out. But we're definitely closing down in 2 days. You have 48 hours, whatever. There was none of that. And it's the same thing we've seen with the lockdown, the Christmas lockdowns. If first you're told you're in tier 2, and then you're in tier 3, then you're in tier 4, then it suddenly, Christmas is cancelled. You have to do this now. There's no sense of, I'm going to anticipate what's happening. I'm going to look at what's happening in other countries. I'm going to follow the science. I'm going to follow the scientific advice. It's just very ad hoc, brinkmanship attitude towards dealing with things. And that's resulted in us having, I think it's the highest number of cases of death per capita, I think, in Europe. I mean, bar Russia, of course.
Yeah, we've definitely been at the top of that list at various points. And even if we're not at the top of it now, we're certainly in the top 5, top 6.
And there's no reason for us.
Yeah, there's no reason why we should be there as one of the wealthiest countries.
But not just the wealthiest countries, we have institutions that monitor these things, right?
Yeah, we've got world-leading scientific advice, scientific institutions. This reminds me of a job I used to do where I used to help vulnerable people, or I used to help people who had issues with the council or with benefits, etc., or people being evicted. A lot of people would just ignore letters that came from the council, and almost as if not dealing with the issue would make it go away. And that's understandable from, those people who just had so much going on at the same time. But not if you're the government. You don't see that corona letter come in and just put it aside because you have to deal with your wife's divorce.
You're right.
But as you said, at the end of March, we're in a very different place. Boris made that famous speech where he put all of us in lockdown. We could only leave our houses for 1 hour a day to go exercise. And then the last thing in March was suddenly Boris put out this video where he looked like he'd been kidnapped, and he was about to ask for a ransom, saying he'd caught corona.
Yes, which was inevitable.
But instead of this being a really good opportunity to say, look, if I can get it, anybody can get it, take it seriously, it was still full of that kind of, I'm all right, I'm doing okay, I'm going to fight this. And maybe that's something we'll talk about at some point, this terminology about fighting coronavirus.
Yes, using warlike terms to this crisis, and it's a health crisis. This is not, despite what conspiracy theorists out there have posited, this is not something that was cooked up in a lab in China. Or maybe it was. Let me not speak too soon.
Yeah.
We don't know where it came from. Some people said aliens. Some people said a meteorite was raining down these viruses on us. But the language that was used in dealing with this was very interesting. Like you said, it was warlike terms. And also there was a lack of sense of responsibility, because in war, it's usually you're defending yourself, right? Defense is usually either you're attacking someone to preempt an attack on yourself, or you're defending yourself after someone has attacked you.
Yeah.
When actually there was no sense of responsibility that we are the government.
Yeah.
We have been placed in here to do a job, and part of our job is protecting people and ensuring that people are as healthy as possible.
Yeah. And
going back to the thing you said about how Boris spoke about of his own infection, this idea that we're British, this idea of British exceptionalism, and it's something that we will talk about in an upcoming series that we have. And this idea that we are somehow uniquely placed as British people, it's almost as if we have very special immune systems, or the air is different here, or the water is different here, where things just don't land like they do. Like, we don't get sick like everyone else does. And that was seen throughout how our government handled this whole thing.
I knew we were in trouble when I heard, when you hear something and it hits you differently, but you're not quite sure why until later.
Okay, what was
when
this?
David Cameron said he thought Boris will be fine because he'd played tennis with him on the fields of Eton or something like that. and had seen what a fighter he was
What?
or something like that. So just to recap the first 3 months, Boris had won his majority. Trump had won his impeachment, for lack of, and both just wanted to get on with their own agendas. And then this crisis hit. This is pop psychology. But I got the sense of they both thought it was unfair. Finally, when they've had their big break, they had to deal with the serious problem. And it's a sense of the UK government, the American government just saying, we'll just hope it goes away. Shall we take a break here? And when we come back, we'll do the next couple of months.
For the second quarter of the year, things just got worse. So in April, Boris was in a coma. I felt there was this national drive to sort of thoughts and prayers. And that's not a very British thing. Let's all lay hands. Let's just lay hands on Boris. Let's just channel positive thoughts and prayers for him to recover. How did you feel about that, by the way? I felt like it was deserved. It didn't surprise me that he had got corona. Is Boris a healthy man anyway?
This really surprised me. When I read the news, let me just disclaimer there. I don't like the Tories. And that's me putting it in a kind of podcast friendly way. But when I read the story, I just had this sinking feeling, how I thought and what I think about the man. I just knew it'd be a bad thing if the Prime Minister dies. That's a third tier cabinet. Whoever steps up to replace Boris is going to be from the bottom drawer. This is a crisis. And the last thing we need are a bunch of self-serving politicians fighting over each other for who should take over the reins.
Yeah, I too dislike the Tories, and I didn't lay my hands on Boris. I wanted the best thing that could have happened for the country, and I left it up to the universe to decide what our fate was going to be. And a big thing that happened for the opposition, which is the Labour Party, they elected a new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who is an ex-defence human rights lawyer, and his first performance at the PMQs I thought was quite impressive. He seems like he has a backbone. And I think I hoped, like many of us out there, that we finally have an opposition that can hold this government to account. And that's something that we need to happen, especially with the PPE shortages. We're now hearing about scandals where private companies were getting contracts. And I was hoping that Keir Starmer was a person who was going to ask the tough questions. What did you think of Keir?
Yeah, similarly. So for our listeners who don't know what PMQs is, that's Prime Minister's Questions, and it's typically 30 minutes on a Wednesday at 12 o'clock, where members of Parliament get to ask the Prime Minister questions. And it's this big performative theatrical piece, right? There's a lot of drama to it. I thought Keir Starmer did really well on his first performance. He was not against Boris, he was against Dominic Raab, who's the second in command. And I think for the first time in a long time, I watched that and I thought, yes, this government will finally be held to account by somebody that a wider set of society takes seriously. Let me put it that way. Because it's not that I think the questions were any better than Jeremy Corbyn's, but I think sometimes politics is performance. You have to understand that it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it, but also, as importantly, how it's understood and how it's received.
It's about likability, because I think Corbyn rubbed people the wrong way, people who have Labour values, but there was just something about him that didn't really stick. And I think a lot of us hope that Keir Starmer is that person who is just a lot more likable. And it sort of early indications show that he is more likable.
I agree. You have to separate the policy from the messenger almost. And there are lots of examples in history of the right message being delivered by the wrong messenger. Look, we have to put how we feel personally about somebody aside and say, are you the person who's best placed to deliver what is the right message, what is a difficult message for lots of people, and what is to an extent a revolutionary message? And I think Corbyn this wasn't his time. He'd come at the wrong time with Brexit. He just didn't perform as he should have. Maybe Keir is more suited to the coronavirus pandemic, which is really about scrutinizing the governments on a kind of technical, scientific basis, in a way that maybe Corbyn might not have done. Who knows?
Yes, and I think his past experience as a lawyer hopefully allows him to ask critical questions and ask questions that are very revealing as to how our government deals with corona and other things. Over in America, we had these anti-lockdown, anti-mask protesters who marched onto the Michigan State House. And these were essentially a group of armed to the teeth white men
Yeah. Yeah.
who essentially shouted down and threatened lawmakers. And the
Yeah.
response there was an appropriate response, which was don't aggravate them, soothe them, like calm them, keep them calm,
Yeah.
and let them go home in peace, even though they're clearly crazy.
Yeah.
But this response was very interesting compared to what happened in May. And I'm sure by now everyone knows what happened in May, which was the murder of George Floyd in broad daylight. And this incident, which was someone had taken a street side recording and it had spread all across the internet, and millions and millions of people around the world saw that. And this incident brought millions of Americans to the streets to protest against pretty much everything that they had felt over years. So the protest was centered around anti-racism, anti-police brutality, racial injustice, the the industrial prison complex. I think it felt like a cathartic moment for Black Americans and actually also Americans of all colors and stripes.
Say his name, George Floyd. Say his name, George Floyd. I can't breathe, George Floyd.
No justice,
No peace,
no racist,
police.
no justice,
No peace,
no racist.
police.
Matter.
Black lives matter.
Black lives matter.
Black lives matter.
And how the police dealt with these protests was very different to how they had dealt with the anti-lockdown, anti-mask protests. So, question for you. Did you watch the George Floyd video?
I watched the first couple of minutes and then it was just too much for me. And one of the things that always happens really, when one of these videos comes out is articles will link to other videos, right? So Philando Castile, Mike Brown, to other stories and other videos. And I made a conscious decision not to watch any of these videos because I realized I wasn't learning anything new from these videos.
Yeah.
Watching the brutalization of other Black bodies wasn't telling me anything I did not know. And in any way, to put it a different way, I spoke to lots of people who also said they didn't watch it. We don't need to be re-traumatized by watching violence against people who look like us for the message to be any clearer that we live in a society that's unfair, that's discriminatory, and where being Black or being a person of color is enough reason to be treated differently. But I understand why people watched it, why people shared it, because I think for lots of people, even today, racism, discrimination isn't real till they see something like that.
Yeah.
Did you see it?
No, I make a point to not watch these sorts of videos at all. There are always people who break it down for you in writing, and so I did read about it. I mean, I read about, in his last moments, he was calling up for his mother, and how that had brought out a lot of mothers into the streets. And there was just something about this video. You're right. Something about this video radicalized people from every walk of life, because these movements were not largely Black, they were largely multiracial in America. And also what they'd done is they had inspired similar movements across the world, because police brutality, racial inequality and injustice are not American things. It's a human experience for millions of people around the world. And similarly, what these protests had done is they had brought out British protesters. I know at the end of May, so our first Black Lives Matter movement in the UK. I know there were police brutality marches across Europe, across Africa. There were also similar movements, similar protests in solidarity with what happened in America. And that was really nice to see. And also, this was a moment of education for a lot of us, because I didn't know about a lot of the police brutality issues that were happening across the world. And so there was something about George Floyd's death, and it just came at the right time, because like you alluded to earlier, this is not the first time this has happened. We have seen and heard of other Black people, Black men, Black women, Black children, and not just also Black people, but just people dying at the hands of the police. And there's something about 2020, the virus, people staying at home, people having to do with so much. This was the last straw. In May, America exploded, and sparks from that fire exploded across the world. And it was just this massive movement, this massive global movement about this central issue, about police, people who have incredible power over us, not doing the things that they've been sworn to do, which is to serve and to protect. But something closer to home.
Just before that,
Yes.
two things you said really encapsulated it perfectly. So one was the difference between how they responded to. Let's just contextualize this even further.
Mhm.
Imagine 50 armed men turn up, threatening to attack the governor,
Mm.
break into the state house. They're literally outside her door, not outside, in the corridors,
Yeah.
and they get to walk home unscathed, untouched, and with their lives.
But also
Yeah,
not arrested or anything.
not arrested, nothing. There are no penalties to this. So the difference between how these men were treated
Mhm.
and the daily experience of black men in America. The other thing you talked about were the which is why they were there in the first place, the anti-lockdown, anti-maskers.
Mhm.
One of the things you would see in the British commentary and sort of right-wing commentators, when the Black Lives Matter protests were in London, people talked about these were spreading coronavirus. These were
Yeah.
Why were they being allowed to do this in the middle of a lockdown, in the middle of a pandemic? It was interesting to see the very same people
Mhm.
essentially inciting people to protest against lockdown, to turn up to the streets and protest against masks.
Yeah.
And in these two stories, for me, it was laid clear just how unequal society is, but more importantly, how lots of people know it is but pretend that it isn't.
The BLM marches, I saw people who were marching responsibly. I saw social distancing. I saw
Yeah,
people, kneeling or standing. People were masked. And so the people were doing their best to make their voices heard and also follow guidelines.
yeah,
But then compared to, like you said, the irony is the exact same people a month or two later marched onto Westminster either to protect the statues that they were scared people would topple or to march against the lockdown because they didn't believe in it, or the coronavirus was a government ploy to control people, and insert any odd conspiracy theory you can find. Also, I think that just before I move on, and this is something we're going to talk about in our bonus material as well, is how the police responded to these movements about police brutality with police brutality, thus
yeah,
proving correct that these movements are necessary. It was a self goal. And this happened across the world. It happened in America, where the police come out in tanks and
yeah, yeah,
literal, army surplus equipment to across the world. And I think it seems like police are the same wherever you go.
yeah,
So let's pivot a little bit. Let's come back home. Dominic Cummings, who is a government advisor to Boris Johnson, he took a trip and there was something about an eye test and there was a castle. And this was what was named the Cumgate scandal.
yeah.
And this exploded across the headlines. And this was, for me, one of the finest examples of personal responsibility that I had ever seen. Or not, because Dominic Cummings took zero personal responsibility. I think he also said when he had I can't even call it an interview because it didn't feel like he was answering the questions the reporters were asking. It was
Yeah.
more of he took a stance and essentially he said, if I could do it again, I would. But how did this resonate with you, this particular story?
So let's remember this was towards the end of sort of mid-May, right? Early May, mid-May.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
By now we'd been in lockdown for quite a while, maybe 6 weeks. 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. People had, and lockdown affected everything from weddings to funerals to birthdays. People cancelled weddings. People had to attend funerals via Zoom.
Yeah.
A lot of people didn't get to say their last goodbyes to their loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them couldn't even attend the funerals of the loved ones because of the lockdown rule.
Yeah.
When Dominic Cummings broke the rules, the government said it's what any caring father would do, which is a slap in the face to every single person who, at enormous personal sacrifice, didn't break the rules. All the people who had to say goodbye remotely, all the people who couldn't be at the bedsides of their dying loved ones because they were respecting the rules and trying to keep all of us safe. And the government's basically saying, you know what? If you didn't do what this guy did, if you didn't drive 60 miles to check your eyesight, if you didn't drive 500 miles, I mean, this guy was hotboxing with his child and his wife.
Yeah.
He's got the virus. So he jumps in a car with his wife and his kid and they drive 500 miles. Was he purposely trying to infect? Is this an attempted murder case more than anything else? Have we missed the bigger picture?
Right. Because it was so ludicrous, the story that was being peddled to the public was that.
Yeah.
And I think something that you just said a minute ago about he did what any good father would do. And there's this sort of mirror statement, which is, you're not a good father, mother,
Yeah.
sister, relative, loved one if you didn't break the rules to make sure that you attended the birth, the wedding, the funeral, if you didn't bundle your family and take them to this long trip. There was something about, if you had followed the rules, you're a chump. And here's Dominic Cummings, who loves his family so much. The love is just breaking out of his chest, right? He's such an incredible person that he
Yeah.
did this for his
Yeah.
family. And then the ludicrous thing about, I wasn't sure if I could hack the drive down, so I took a 60-mile drive to a castle to check my eyesight. Now, I've driven for about 4 hours at one time. I don't have perfect eyesight. I've attended many eye tests. This is not how you check how good your eyesight is. And also, if you are in doubt that your eyesight is so bad that you can't take, was it like, how many miles was it? A multi-100-mile trip. You don't test your eyesight. You just stay where you are,
Yeah.
or take a train down, or you figure it out, but you don't get into the car and you drive. The way this was sold to us was, it was almost like the Rock movie, you know, where he breaks all odds and does it. It was Taken, essentially, but with a spin on it, right? That
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
this. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, it was like, the love he had for his family was so incredible. He just broke all rules so that he could take them to a castle. And he was so unrepentant. He was so belligerent at that Rose Garden conference, whatever you want to call it. It was incredible. I was completely stunned.
This was exactly like when Jacob Rees-Mogg said, so the people in Grenfell Tower, a lot of them died because they followed the stay put order. The fire brigade had asked people to stay in their houses, which in a normal functioning building would have been the right advice to take. Jacob Rees-Mogg said, had it been
Yes.
him, he would have used his common sense and left the building. And again, it's this idea that,
Oh God. Yeah.
those of us who follow the rules are chumps, right? We don't value our lives or our family's lives or the health of our loved ones in following the rules. And this was a pattern that we saw throughout the year, right? And what you said earlier, not just British exceptionalism, but a particular right-wing exceptionalism where the rules only apply to others and not to you.
Yes. And once again, there's another parallel to the story about the anti-maskers who then turned out, who were very much against the BLM marches, saying they're spreading the corona, who are also happen to be COVID deniers, whatever, right? Once again, these are people who belong to a party that pushes a very hard line, hardcore stance on crime, right? These are people who are if you commit a crime, you do the time. And the time, regardless of how long it is, you take personal responsibility, and you go into prison, and you do your time. You commit a crime, there is no mercy. I wouldn't even call it justice. It's almost like revenge. These are people who, they're the law and order. Like in America, the Republicans are the law and order party, and our Tories are very much the same, right? If you're an illegal immigrant, how dare you come into the country? If you're an asylum seeker and you don't follow the rules, and this happens to you, and you don't file papers properly, whatever the situation is, the Tories are they're the party of law and order. And yet we see time and time again high-level members flout the rules that they themselves set. And then when we have the chagrin to turn to them and point out their mistakes, we're told that we're not sensible. We should have used our common sense. We don't love our families enough. And what Dominic Cummings did inspired a lot of people to do the same. Because I remember reading stories about police stopping people who were traveling and then saying, well, Dominic Cummings did it, so why can't I? And there is no answer to that. There is nothing the police can say until they arrest Dominic Cummings for flouting the rules, which they still haven't done. Because until you can follow through with the laws that have been set, you can't stop someone else from doing the same thing. June, which is the last month of the second quarter, the BLM demonstrations spread across the UK, and I think there was a protest in every major city. Statues were decapitated. There was a Columbus statue in America that was decapitated. They toppled the Colston statue in Bristol. A lot of these statues of very questionable white men were removed from the public square. And a lot of people didn't understand why that was even necessary. And a lot of people called it whitewashing history and not acknowledging history. But I don't know about you, but I have never turned up to a statue
Yeah.
and thought, this is where I'm going to learn about history. I've always turned to books, documentaries. I've often visited museum to learn about history. Statues are clearly things that we build for people that we honor. And let no one try and say that it's about whitewashing
Yeah.
history, because we can easily take these statues and put them in a museum where we can then tell the full story and picture about who these questionable people were.
The Colston statue and a lot of the statues of racists in America were not
Mm.
put up in their lifetimes. These were put hundreds of years later to
No.
make a point. These were supposed to send a very clear message. These were not about
Yes.
honoring them in their lifetime or just after they died. Why is a statue of a Confederate general being put up in the
Yes.
1930s? The second point is people are talking about erasing history. History has been whitewashed, literally. You know, you're talking about one statue when the
Mm.
curriculum you and I studied at school didn't talk about so much stuff.
Yes. And another thing that happened in June was Marcus Rashford started his campaign. I don't think it started because I think his campaign has been happening for quite a while, but his campaign really came into the forefront about, and this was a campaign to feed poor young people throughout the summer, because by this time the schools were about to close if they had not already closed. I think they had closed for the lockdown, and thousands of young people across the country in disadvantaged and poorer communities were facing a summer of no food for whatever reason. And so Marcus Rashford's campaign forced the government to make a U-turn and promise to fund feeding programs for children throughout the summer. For me, this was a big moment. I saw our system laid bare in all its utter ugliness and rottenness. I heard people talking about personal responsibility. And this is an idea that I think we will talk about in many, many episodes to come. And we'll talk about it continually. And how this idea of personal
Yeah.
responsibility is used as a truncheon to beat poor people with when it comes to funding their needs, their basic needs,
Yeah.
and protecting consumers and protecting poorer people from private companies who use the government as a bully to get their way. I read
Yeah.
and I heard people talking about, where are the parents of these children? Why are they not feeding their kids? I saw something on Twitter, someone who said something along the lines of, I know women like this and they take their benefits and they go and buy designer bags. And so what you're saying is you're clearly acknowledging that they're children in neglectful situations, which, by the way, is an aspect of child abuse. And in trying to make a point, you're going to leave these children in these situations unfed, malnourished, neglected, just because you don't want to spend a few million to make sure that our youngest and some of our most vulnerable in our communities are fed, but are happy with the billions that were spent on a track and trace system that is
Yeah.
not effective. You're not calling for the government to have an inquiry set to investigate where all these billions were spent on PPE, but feeding the
Yeah.
children, that's just a
I
bridge
mean,
too far for you.
it's such a strange logic. So let's go full stereotype, right? Your mom's a crack addict. Your dad's the one selling the crack to her. You know, you don't see your parents for days on end. They're leaving you. Your house is
Oh my
dirty, etc.
goodness.
Isn't that all the more reason why we should step in
Mm.
and look after these children? I don't understand this argument that says if your parents
Hmm.
are neglecting you, then the state should also neglect you. I just don't get it. And that's what we kept hearing, that, where are all these parents? They're bad parents. So your solution to knowing that a child has bad parents is to leave them be.
Hmm.
But, it's a convenient argument because the truth is much worse than that, is that the vast majority
Yes.
of parents who can't afford to feed their children are working, right? They're working very hard.
The working poor.
They just, at the end of the month,
Hmm.
especially with where a lot of them were furloughed and get 80%, if 100% isn't enough, then imagine getting a 20% pay cut.
Hmm.
And so this idea that all these wanton parents just putting their hands up for a handout, because this whole point you were saying about personal responsibility.
Yeah. So one big story that came out from America was Joe Biden was finally nominated as the Democratic nominee for the third time, because this is the third time he'd run, so third time's the charm, I suppose. I don't know about you, but I wasn't surprised that Joe Biden was picked because he's promised a return to normalcy. And we're talking about, times bygone, a bygone era where politicians and people had the decency to hide corruption and not do it the Trump way, in your face, unapologetic, unrepentant. What did you think of Joe Biden, by the way?
I get it. It's been a weird few years, and if people want to return to normal, whatever that means, I understand. A lot of people are just tired of hearing about the nonsense that came out of Donald Trump. They're just tired of this new world that we found ourselves in. People are just tired, and people are saying, look, can I just get the old system?
Mm-hmm.
We see this over history all the time. People are just saying, you know what, I wasn't happy with the old system, but at least I understood the rules. I knew how it worked. The thing about
and join us in part 2 as we go over the second half of 2020.